Well, it's tragic that because of Ebola, we kind of have a focus and an emphasis on the primary health care, which should have been a concern of ours for a long time. Sometimes we don't consider the global public goods responsibility on these issues, and that's why we have seen some of the institutions in charge of these issues internationally, such as WHO, having a dwindling contribution. Not long ago, about 2 years ago, they were actually reducing their budget for about a third. And we see the consequences is that we don't have a treatment of global public goods as we should. I think the investments in the health sector have actually gone up in Africa in general, but it's far from being what is needed or from covering what is needed. In Guinea, in the latest Mo Ibrahim index, Guinea actually goes up in terms of health systems, transformation, and some of the indicators are quite positive. But we must also say that when you have something like Ebola that is not known, it can create easily panic, hysteria, and also it can undermine the systems that you have if they are fragile. We are seeing that even in European countries, there is a bit of fragility because they don't know exactly this particular disease. So I hope that we are going to look into this area and this sector with a structural eye and not just when there is a panic and an emergency. Well, you see, agriculture is very important because the majority of our labor force is in agriculture, and we expect that their contribution to the economy, which is already quite small, about 6% of combined Africa GDP, if we continue with the same trends, will go to about 2% in 10 years or so. So that means more poverty because you basically have a situation where part of the rural population is moving into cities. And therefore, you may think that is positive, but they are moving into slums, and therefore, it doesn't change really their social condition. I think that is very problematic. But for those who stay, the recipe is rather simple. If we were to treat agriculture economically, normally we treat it as a social sector and we treat it as a poverty reduction program. If we were to treat it economically, it means that we need to increase agricultural productivity. There is no real example in the world where agricultural productivity has grown fast. There are examples of growing slowly, but growing fast is our concern because we have a lot of people on poverty without some incentive structure that is going to create, the mechanisms to propel this productivity. And the best examples we have are linked to industrialization. You industrialize a country and the agricultural productivity is pooled. And that is what we are trying to sell as an idea. And I think this fora had the opportunity of discussing innovative financing, but also the different mechanisms of policy that will create the right incentives. So agriculture is a very good example of that. Well, illicit financial flows, first we have to look into its complexity. There is a part that is outright criminal. So, people that are in drugs and arms trafficking and all kinds of traffics. So that's outright criminal. We need a very robust response. And obviously it has a lot of implications in terms of peace and security. Then you have another part that is not necessarily appearing as criminal, even illegal, but is hidden. We just don't know. For instance, taxation systems can allow multinational companies to have part of their activity in a specific country, let's say an African country, but actually never pay taxes because they will declare that most of the activity is somewhere else. If we don't have regulatory systems that are going to actually arrest this type of situation, you are going to have a lot of loss. And then, of course, you have also the entire discussion about trade mispricing, which is a big portion of illicit financial flows, which is paying less the value of the commodities we export. All of this combined, plus the fact that institutions are very weak and corruption is pervasive because institutions, when they are weak, they don't deal with corruption, and the lack of transparency from the origin countries of these companies. Like, for instance, the fact that we don't have transparency laws in Europe equivalent to what we have in the US with the Dodd-Frank legislation, create really a situation where the loss for Africa is quite huge. And at a micro level, you will see it from the extractive industries, for instance, that instead of promoting small mining, there's a very important contribution of women miners in Southern Africa, but this is not given its due respect and opportunity because it's almost impossible to compete with those who are basically having their activity on the back of illicit flows. I think it's important for us to first say that the record is not very favorable to Africa in terms of various funds that have been created in the past. They had a target to support the most affected countries in need, and in reality that has not happened. The Global Environment Facility was created for that purpose, and eventually only 7% of its funds came to Africa. Now there is the Green Climate Fund, and there are other mechanisms that are being put in place. The RED is another one. All of those, Africa is not taking the full advantage of the opportunities that are announced. Not because Africa doesn't want, not because Africa is not prepared, but because the complexity that is associated with this type of funding makes it very difficult for a small entity or even a small country to be able to present meaningful bankable projects. So we have to change this. And that's why we are talking about climate financing as an innovative way of changing this picture, starting already with the creation of our own climate financing mechanism, which is part of a joint initiative by ECA, ourselves, African Development Bank and the African Union, which now has a fund based in the African Development Bank to deal with climate financing in Africa. It's a small amount, but that one at least we control, and we know it's a very good start for us to start changing the debate about how to handle this type of complexity.